Hello and welcome to News 10 Time. Shereen Bhan. The leaders of G20 nations wrapped up their summit in Bali with a joint declaration condemning the war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin did not attend the summit, and Russia's foreign minister who attended the event was not present on the last day. Meanwhile, India has taken over the G20 presidency from Indonesia. Kiran Khatri and Arundhati Ramanan wrap up what was an eventful summit.
G20 leaders in Bali woke up to news of an explosion in Poland which killed at least 2 people near the Ukraine border. US President Joe Biden called for an emergency meeting of G7 and NATO leaders on the sidelines of the summit. After the meeting, Biden said it was unlikely that the missile was fired by Russia.
Contest that. I don't want to say that till we completely investigate, but it's unlikely in the minds of the trajectory that it was fired from Russia, but we'll see.
The G20 joint declaration condemned the war in Ukraine in strong terms. The statement said it deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and demands its complete and unconditional withdrawal. The statement went on to say the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. The peaceful resolution of conflicts, efforts to address crisis, as well as diplomacy and dialogue are vital. Today's era must not be of war. These words echoed what Prime Minister Modi said at the Shanghai Cooperation Summit in September.
Prime Minister's message that this is not the era of war and that the best ways to return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy to resolve the conflict resonated very deeply across all the delegations.
Post the final declaration, it was time for Indonesia to hand over the G20 presidency to India by passing the honorary gavel. India will hold a high-profile gathering next year. In the build-up, there will be 200 meetings across 32 different sectors, culminating in the summit on September 9th and 10th of 2023.
आज मैं ये आश्वासन देना चाहता हूं कि भारत की G20 अध्यक्षता इंक्लूसिव, एम्बिशियस, डिसिसिव और एक्शन ओरिएंटेड होगी.
From sessions on health and digital transformation to bilateral meetings with world leaders, PM Modi had a packed schedule in Bali. He held bilateral talks with leaders of Germany, Italy, France, and the UK. The new British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak approved 3,000 work visas for Indian professionals after meeting Prime Minister Modi. However, there was no bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and China's President Xi Jinping. Both leaders came face-to-face at a dinner and exchanged pleasantries, but they have not held any bilateral talks since the clash between Indian and Chinese soldiers in Galwan Valley in May 2020. One of the highlights of the summit was the meeting between President Xi and President Biden, where they reached common ground in warning Russia over the use of nuclear weapons and agreeing to restart climate talks to cut emissions. President Biden also said he does not believe there's any imminent attempt by China to invade Taiwan. One leader who skipped the G20 summit was Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov did represent Russia in his place. However, he left the summit before the joint declaration condemning the Ukraine war was released. In Mumbai with Kiran Khatri, Arundhati Ramanan.
Highlights of the G20 summit in Bali. Prime Minister Modi met Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of UK, for the first time since his tenure began. Abhishek Jha brings us the highlights from that meeting. Abhishek.
His meeting with UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was much awaited because this was the first meeting of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Rishi Sunak ever since he has been elected as the UK's Prime Minister. And there are a lot of aspects where India and UK wants to collaborate. Those are the free trade agreement that could actually be India's first bilateral free trade agreement with any European countries. And ever since the Brexit, UK is actually trying hard to get bilateral free trade agreements with countries, especially India. Also, Rishi Sunak has given a green signal to allowing 3,000 visa to Indian workforce, which will be in the age group of 18 to 30. They can go to UK and can explore their life in terms of professional life or cultural exchanges as well. India will also reciprocate the same number of visa next year.
Abhishek, many thanks for joining us. Well, to take this discussion forward on what the G20 presidency means for India, joining us today is Richard Rossow, Senior Advisor at Center for Strategic and International Studies. Also with us, Ambassador Navdeep Suri, Distinguished Fellow at ORF. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the program. Ambassador Suri, let me start by asking you of what you make of the final declaration that's come in from the G20. In a conversation with me just a short while ago, the G20 Sherpa for India, Amitabh Kant, talked about how the last 48 hours were very difficult, but India, along with the support of countries like Brazil, Turkey, Singapore, Argentina, managing to change the final text of the communique when it comes to the war in Russia and Ukraine, going with the statement made by Prime Minister Modi, and the statement says today's era must not be one of war. I'll start by asking you, Ambassador Suri, what you make of the final text that we saw coming in from the G20 and India's impact.
Oh, well, Shereen, first thing I'll say is it's a very long statement. It's 52 paragraphs and it covers almost everything under the sun. But you know, on Ukraine and Russia in particular, I think when I looked at the statement, I was struck, one, of course, by the fact that our language, our formulation about this is not the era of war is there, and the emphasis on dialogue and diplomacy to resolve conflicts. But what struck me also was the really strong language that has been used in the opening paragraph, in fact, about deploring in the strongest terms the aggression by Russia and demanding its complete and unconditional withdrawal. And I think that's a bit of a slap on the wrist for China as well, because you know, China's sort of unlimited support for Russia certainly doesn't seem to get reflected in the tenor of this statement. So I would say that on both counts, the fact that China clearly wasn't able to obstruct such strong language against Russia from coming through, and India's formulation getting in, are both significant elements.
Yes, both significant elements, and you're absolutely right in pointing out that the final communique has just about addressed every challenge that we face, from food security to climate transition to, of course, cryptocurrencies, macroeconomic stability, pandemic response, what have you. Richard, let me address that issue with you. India takes over the G20 presidency when the world is going through difficult times, and increasingly more challenges are expected given the geopolitical pressures and friction that we just spoke of. What's the expectation? You know, in a conversation with me, the IMF MD believes that this could, in fact, be India's breakthrough moment, taking over the G20 presidency. You had a conversation with Amitabh Kant, the CSIS hosted him as well. What's the expectation?
Well, I think it could go in two different directions. Could there be a crisis that's going to derail India's leadership and basically focus the agenda on something that is a little more narrow? It could be, you know, if the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues and the United States continues to put pressure on summits like the G20 to be very forward-leaning in these kind of statements, well, then you're going to have a little bit less room and space, I think, to add in some of the agenda items that I know India would like to focus on. You know, similarly, if we have another massive COVID wave, that could kind of derail more progressive, forward-leaning things. But if we have a relatively clear path, if the Russian invasion, you know, things are a little more calm, if we don't have another COVID wave, India has some great things to tout that I think the rest of the world can take advantage of. You know, it's terrific work on digitizing public services and delivery there, the Jam Trinity, things like this. So a lot of terrific lessons I think the world can borrow from. And when we look at climate change and we look at a lot of the great challenges there, India has been leading in a lot of ways. And I also like the fact that throughout the summit, India is going to be hosting so many events and bringing a lot of these messages to subnational leaders. India, like the United States, you know, our subnational governments are very powerful and frankly have a lot more at stake at what's being discussed at the G20 table. So I also hope that India is going to be able to I think, bring in some of these subnational leadership voices that at the end of the day are really on the hook for taking the actions that's going to make G20 declarations come to life.
Yes, you're right in pointing out that the actual execution of plans happens at the state level, what you call subnational level, and that's right in pointing out. Ambassador Suri, I want to address what we heard there from Prime Minister Modi saying that India's agenda will be inclusive, ambitious and decisive. Richard talked about one of the aspects that I know the Indian administration is going to be keen to showcase, which is what we've done on the digitization side, especially the digitization of public services. Outside of that, what would you expect in terms of narrative building, narrative shaping?
I think apart from digital public goods that India has created and the model or the template that it has set in place, which I think a number of countries are already showing an interest in, and it's something that we certainly want to try and build upon. There's going to be a significant focus on showing India's diversity, India's culture, but also to take advantage of the unique window of opportunity, I think, that we, as the developing world, have, that the baton passes from Indonesia to India, and then on to Brazil, and then on to South Africa. So really, at the most prestigious decision-making body, you have 4 developing countries coming in quick succession, and really with an opportunity to try and put their agendas, their concerns, their priorities on the table. And some of that you see already reflected in this year's G20 statement in terms of the very strong concern about food security, about energy security, about the sustainable development goals and all of that. So the fact that India will be also doing 200 events spread across the country. Let me give you a little snippet. I'm from Amritsar, and I was there recently, and there was a lot of excitement in the city, and already committees have been set up and so on. So this decentralized way of going about and holding different events in different places really gets a buy-in from a range of domestic constituencies into the G20 process.
Yes, that is going to be exciting to watch as these 200 events across different parts of India take off as India takes over the G20 presidency. Richard, you know, Ambassador Suri spoke about one of the challenges that the G20 communique focuses on and addresses or hopes to address, and that's the issue of food security. In fact, a couple of paragraphs specific to addressing the challenge of food security. And we have this on a day that the world's population has touched 8 billion. Do you believe that there will need to be some nuancing of the India position? Because the communique talks about the need for free flow of food, of no restrictions as far as exports, etc. are concerned. We do know that India did impose export bans, curbs, restrictions, even though in many cases the government route was left open. Perhaps more nuancing will be needed in light of what we've seen from the G20?
Well, I do think countries at the end of the day, when you're in crisis, will act in their own self-interest, and you have to react to voters. You know, it's we all treasure and pride ourselves as being democracies, but that also means voters have more sway than our leaders do if an issue really kind of hits the top level, as we saw during the COVID crisis. Concerns about having medical equipment, about having food supplies. When that became really dominant in voters' minds, you know, elected leaders have to accommodate that. You know, luckily, I think as you see with India, you know, there is a lot more production that's even kind of captured in the markets because of, you know, food wastage and routing. A lot of countries have, you know, similar issues. So, you know, there's a whole lot more that can be captured in the value chain there. And when we think about Make in India and the ability for India to begin developing a much stronger food processing industry, packaging, and being able to export, there's a lot, I think, that can be captured on the table, even without, I think, sort of eroding voter trust by taking steps, you know, as part of, you know, international forums that could limit voter interest in a country's own self-interest. So there are limits to what a joint statement can accomplish, but I think there's a lot of good work that could be done there on reducing wastage and things like that, where we all have a lot of ideas we can share. And hopefully, you know, again, this could be a step up for India's Make in India campaign as well. Processing the food and beginning to showcase, you know, some of these great food flavors for the rest of the world. So maybe some opportunity there. And
Well, speaking of opportunities, Ambassador Suri, and let me give you the final word on this. Richard spoke about how this could be a step up as far as the Make in India campaign and ambition is concerned. Where else do you believe we could see potential opportunity in light of the handing over of the G20 presidency? What do you believe should be the areas of focus for India at this point in time?
I think the areas of focus for India are going to be its own technological strengths, its potential for tourism to showcase its cultural riches, and some of the key programs that the Prime Minister has initiated, whether we are talking about the Make in India, whether we are talking about some of the infrastructure-related programs like Gati Shakti, whether we are talking about some of the social impact programs pertaining to water, etc. These are challenges that are not unique to India. I've spent a fair amount of my career in Africa, for example, and I know that many countries in Africa look up to the Indian example in many of these cases. India produces solutions that are much more relevant to the on-the-ground conditions of many developing countries as compared to some of the solutions that might come out of Scandinavia as a case in point. So I think India has the capacity to and the opportunity to not only convey its strengths, but also the solutions that we are coming up with for some of our developmental challenges, and how India can be kind of a lighthouse for other developing countries in terms of the replicability and scalability of the solutions that are coming from India.
Yes, new ideas that can be scaled up and exported. Richard, the final word from you on what we heard there from President Biden in light of the bilateral or the meeting with President Xi, both sides saying that, look, we don't want a Cold War. What do you believe the implications will be from here on?
I think the implications of the summit and the bilateral are going to be very, very light, very thin. I suspect that China is not going to change its direction on trying to dominate technology flows and using them for military and security application. The United States is continuing to try to respond to that and make sure that ultimately, security across the Indo-Pacific is maintained, working with partners, including India. So it's nice that they had a warm, cordial summit, but I suspect that neither leader is behind the scenes going to necessarily change the direction they were moving in before. I hope I'm wrong on that, and it certainly is good that we find some places like climate for more positive discussions. But ultimately, we've seen China really present a destabilizing factor in the region. India knows it extremely well, and I suspect that's not going to change. So I think we're going to look back on this and say it was a nice moment, but ultimately the two countries' interests lie elsewhere.
And we don't know if much will change on the ground. Richard and Ambassador Suri, always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here on the News Center to make sense of the final communique that came in from the G20 and what we should expect from India's G20 presidency. Appreciate your time. We will head into a break, but when we return, 2 people killed after a missile hits a Polish village near the Ukrainian border. Polish president says there is no evidence to conclude that Russia was behind the attack. Beata Gorka, Winter Research Fellow at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, joins us when we return.